The night I laughed at Jeon Siwon was the same night I signed my own fate into his hands. I didn't know who he was. That was the problem. Or perhaps, looking back now, standing in the rain outside the building that used to carry my name, that was the only thing that saved me long enough to matter to him. Seoul in October smells like cold money and chrysanthemums. I had been in the city for 14 months when the Hana Lux Gala happened, the kind of event where chandeliers cost more than most people's annual salaries, and no one speaks above a murmur because loudness is the first sign of poverty. I was there representing Adaeze Creative Group, the brand consultancy I had built from nothing across 3 years, 2 continents, and one devastating heartbreak I never talk about. My company had just landed a contract with Hana Lux's fashion division, which meant I was finally being let in through the front door instead of delivering proposals through the side entrance. I wore a floor-length black gown with gold threading that my mother had sent from Lagos, a piece she said contained her prayers. I had laughed at her when she said it. I wasn't laughing anymore. The room was immaculate. A string quartet in the corner. Diplomats and their curated wives. Korean corporate titans who wore their power so quietly you could mistake them for marble statues. I moved through it all with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned early that you either master the room or the room masters you. I was reaching for a glass of champagne when I bumped into him. Not a collision, just a brush of shoulders. Enough to make me look up. He was tall for a Korean man. Black suit, no tie, collar open by exactly 1 button, a level of casual that on any other person would read as oversight but on him read as authority. His face was the kind that paintings tried and failed to capture. Angular, still, unreadable in the way that deep water is unreadable. He was looking across the room at something, not at me, and his expression hadn't shifted 1 millimeter from whatever it had been before I touched him. I said, "I'm so sorry," in Korean. I was still learning. My accent bent the syllables wrong. He didn't respond. I said it again. He still didn't look at me. Something flashed in me. Call it jet lag. Call it 14 months of being talked through and overlooked in a city that still sometimes treated me as a curiosity rather than a colleague. Call it the ghost of every man who had made me feel invisible and been rewarded for it. I stepped slightly in front of him so he couldn't avoid my gaze and said, in English this time, or perhaps manners skipped that generation. Man beside him, shorter, in a gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, went completely still. Like a prey animal that hears something in the grass it cannot see. The man in black finally looked at me. That was when I understood in some wordless part of my chest that I had made an error. Not because his eyes were cold, they weren't. They were darker than I expected, and completely calm, and they held mine with the kind of unhurried attention that powerful people usually reserve only for threats. He looked at me for 4 full seconds without speaking. Then he looked away again. No anger. No embarrassment. Not even amusement. Just that seamless, terrifying return to whatever his thoughts had been before I interrupted them. I told myself he was simply rude. I picked up my champagne. I moved to the other side of the room. I did not learn his name that night, but he already knew mine. 3 weeks later, I received a letter, not an email, not a digital notification. A physical letter, cream-colored, sealed with dark blue wax, delivered by a man in a black car who handed it to my receptionist and left without saying a single word. The letter said, Adaeze Creative Group is invited to submit a brand restructuring proposal for Jeon Holdings International. Compensation package, 40 million won retainer plus full operational partnership rights. Response required within 48 hours. JSHI read it 3 times. Jeon Holdings International was not a company that needed brand consultancies. It was a company that ate brand consultancies. A conglomerate that had its fingers in technology, real estate, private equity, pharmaceutical distribution, and according to whispers that circulated in the business circles I was carefully entering, several things that never appeared on any official registry. A company so insulated that even Korean financial journalists treated it with a careful, deliberate distance, like a beautiful animal that might be poisonous. I typed the name into my search engine. The first result was a photograph from a business conference 2 years prior. A panel of executives, and there, seated at the end, not leaning into the microphone like the others, not performing engagement, simply present, the way a blade is simply present, was the man from the gala, Jeon Siwon. Heir to Jeon Holdings International, 34 years old, unmarried, MIT graduate. Rumored to have restructured 3 failing subsidiaries before 30, doubled the company's international portfolio in 18 months, and in a line that appeared in exactly one Korean financial blog before the article was apparently removed, was described as a man whose silence is always more expensive than anyone else's loudest threats. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Then I did what every sensible woman who has built something real with her own hands does when confronted with a situation that is either the greatest opportunity of her career or the most elegant trap she has ever seen. I called my best friend. Jeon Siwon had been my closest friend since we were 17, and she currently ran a legal consulting firm in London that specialized in corporate governance. She was the only person on earth who could make me feel simultaneously encouraged and genuinely afraid. "Send me the letter," she said. I heard her reading. Silence. Then, "Zara, I know. This is either extraordinary or it's the beginning of something you cannot walk back from. I know that too. What do you know about this man? Enough to know I don't know nearly enough. Then find out more before you respond. And Zara." Her voice shifted slightly, that low, careful register she used when she wanted me to actually listen. "The fact that he sent you a letter 3 weeks after you insulted him at a party is not accidental. That man is telling you something. Figure out what it is before you walk into his world." I thought about his eyes, 4 seconds, then the deliberate, unhurried return to stillness. "He's not threatening me," I said, though I wasn't sure why I was sure. "No," Jeon said. "That's what worries me." I submitted the proposal. Of course I did, not because I was naive, because I had spent 3 years building something worth protecting. And 40 million won could shield it for another year while I expanded into the Japanese market the way I had been planning. And because, I will be honest, at least to myself, the man had looked at me for 4 seconds and then looked away, and some irrational part of me that I deeply resented wanted to know what it would take to make those 4 seconds longer. The first meeting was at Jeon Holdings' Seoul headquarters, a glass tower in Gangnam that caught the morning light and turned it into something sharp and cold. I arrived with my senior strategist, Kwame, and my creative director, Hayun, and I wore a cobalt blue suit that I had bought specifically because it was the color of something that refused to be invisible. We were taken to the 42nd floor. Conference room made almost entirely of glass, looking out over the city from a height that made everything below feel like a model being assembled by someone who hadn't finished yet. There were 4 people on their side of the table. 3 I did not recognize. And Jeon Siwon at the far end, not at the head, never the obvious position I would learn with a single folder in front of him and his hands flat on the table. He looked up when I walked in. He didn't smile. He didn't stand. He simply tracked me the way a lens tracks a moving subject, precise, unhurried, complete. I set my portfolio on the table and sat down directly across from the empty chair that faced him. Not beside it, across. I wanted the geometry to be clear. "Mr. Jeon," I said. "Zara Adaeze Okafor, thank you for the invitation." "You're late," he said. His English was precise and unaccented and quiet. I glanced at my watch. We were 4 minutes early. "Then your clock is wrong," I said. Something shifted in the room. One of his associates, the one closest to him, a man who I would later learn was named Park Jin-hyuk, and who was equal parts executive assistant and something significantly more, pressed his lips together in an expression that might have been the controlled suppression of alarm. Jeon Siwon looked at me. 4 seconds. 5. Then he said, "Begin your presentation." It went for 90 minutes. I watched him the entire time, even when I was speaking to the room, which is a skill I had developed specifically because the most powerful person in any room is always the one who appears least engaged while processing everything. He asked 4 questions. Each one was surgical. Each one found exactly the assumption I had made that I couldn't fully defend, turned it over, examined its underside, and set it back down without comment. At the end, I was more intellectually stimulated than I had been in 8 months, and more disturbed when the others filed out. He remained. I told Kwame and Hayun to wait in the lobby. The room became very quiet. "Your proposal is good," he said. It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a measured assessment. "Thank you. You priced your retainer too low." I looked at him. "Excuse me." Companies that underprice themselves communicate uncertainty about their value. You are not uncertain. He paused. "Adjust the figure. We will sign next week." He picked up his folder and stood. He was already moving toward the door when something in me, the same something that had stepped in front of him at the gala, said, "Don't let him walk away like this. Mr. Jeon." He stopped. He didn't turn immediately. There was a beat, a measured pause, and then he turned and looked at me across the empty conference room with the kind of complete attention that felt somehow like pressure. "Why my company?" I asked. "You have 18 subsidiaries. 4 have internal creative teams. You don't need us." Silence lasted long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. "No," he said. "I don't need you." He left. I stood in that glass room 42 floors above Seoul and tried to figure out why that answer felt more significant than any yes I had ever received. The contract was signed on a Thursday. By the following Monday, I understood that Jeon Holdings was not simply a corporation. It was an ecosystem with its own weather patterns, its own food chain, and its own laws that were older and heavier than anything printed in any commercial statute. Ha-yoon was the one who told me, quietly, in the kitchen of our office late on a Tuesday night when everyone else had gone home, her voice low in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Zara SSI," she said, using the honorific even though I had told her many times she didn't need to. "You know who Jeon Siwon's father is? Jeon Hyunmin, founder of Jeon Holdings." She turned her cup between her hands. "And before that, I waited. There are families in Seoul," Ha-yoon said carefully, "that built their companies on things that are not in any annual report. Jeon Hyunmin was not always a businessman, the world he came from." She stopped, restarted. "The company is legitimate now, entirely. C1 SSI spent 10 years making it legitimate. But the people who remember where it came from, they don't forget, and they don't disappear." I sat with that for a long moment. Outside our office window, Seoul glittered and hummed. "Is he dangerous?" I asked. Ha-yoon looked at me with something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration. "Zara SSI, the most dangerous men are the ones who don't need to be dangerous anymore, but everyone knows they could be. Do you understand?" I understood completely. I also understood, with a clarity that both frightened me and anchored me, that I had already decided I wasn't leaving the first time I saw who he actually was. Not the executive, not the boardroom presence, not the legend that surrounded his name. Was 6 weeks into the contract, at 3 a.m. I was working late at the Jeon Holdings creative suite they had allocated to my team. The building was almost empty. I was walking back from the printer, barefoot because my heels had become genuinely hostile by hour 11, when I turned a corner and found him. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window at the end of the corridor. Still in his dress shirt, jacket gone, sleeves pushed to the elbow. Not looking at his phone, not reading anything. Just standing in the dark, looking out at the city, and for one unguarded moment before he heard me, his face held an expression I had never seen on it before. Not sadness exactly, something older than sadness. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something for so long they can no longer remember what it felt like to set it down. He heard my footsteps. His face closed, smooth and immediate, like water returning to stillness. He looked at me. I looked at him. I said, because I didn't have anything more sophisticated, and because it was 3 a.m. and I had left my professional armor somewhere around midnight. "You should sleep." He said, "You're barefoot. My shoes and I are in a difficult period." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, the shadow of one, the possibility of one. "Go home, Ms. Okafor." "Zara," I said, "I don't know why, just Zara, it's 3 a.m. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Zara." My name in his voice was a different thing entirely. Lower, more careful, like he was aware of the weight of it. "Good night," he said, and turned back to the window. I walked to the elevator. My heart was doing something entirely unprofessional. The call came on a Friday. Yetun's voice was different. Tighter, the carefully managed calm of someone delivering news they have been preparing themselves to deliver for days. "Zara, I need you to listen to me without reacting until I finish." I was in my office. I sat down slowly. "Tell me." "I was approached 3 days ago by a man named Kwon Dsik. He represents a group of investors, Korean, private, very old money, who are interested in acquiring Adaeze creative group." Me finish. "He told me that the group has already had preliminary conversations with one of your internal stakeholders, someone who has been sharing company financial data, client lists, and internal strategy documents. Someone on the inside." Room felt colder. "Who?" Wouldn't confirm a name. But Zara, the level of detail he had, the figures he quoted, the project timelines, it could only be someone with senior access. I thought of Kwame. I thought of Ha-yoon. I thought of the 3 years I had spent building this team, choosing each person deliberately, trusting them with the architecture of everything I had made. There's something else, Yeton said. Kwon D6 Investment Group, I ran them. Zara, they are a front. They have no independent capital. They are funded through a shell structure that traces back 6 layers deep to a man named Jeon Siwon. Silence that followed that sentence was absolute. Jeon Siwon, Siwon's father. I sat in my office in a glass tower in Seoul with my mother's prayers woven into the gown I had worn to a gala where I had mocked a man I didn't know, and I tried to breathe through the specific agony of realizing that I had walked into something that was designed before I arrived. I said, "They want to acquire me so they can use my company as a vehicle for something." That's my read. Yes. Siwon. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. Is he part of it? I don't know, Yetund said. And that, from Yetund, who always knew, was the most frightening sentence of all. I didn't call ahead. It was a Saturday evening. I had spent 24 hours building a wall around my panic and another 12 hours deciding what to do with the truth. I drove to the address I had, not the office, but the private residential tower in Hanamdong, where I knew from a detail that had slipped in an administrative document he kept his personal residence. It was raining. Of course it was raining. Seoul's October rain is cold and relentless and has no sympathy for the emotional significance of moments. The security at the building was extraordinary. I told them my name. I told them I was there for Jeon Siwon. I told them, with a calm I manufactured from sheer necessity, that if they did not let him know I was there, they would regret the choice by morning. I waited for 7 minutes in the lobby. Then his voice came through the security phone, quiet and immediate. "Let her up." He opened the door himself. He was in gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt, and the domesticity of it, the sheer human ordinariness of it against everything I had been told and everything I feared, almost broke my composure. Almost. I walked past him into the apartment. It was extraordinary, dark wood, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the rain-soaked city, art on the walls that was chosen not for display, but because someone had actually looked at it and wanted it near them. Books everywhere, real ones, stacked with the slightly chaotic affection of a person who actually reads. I turned to face him. "Your father is trying to acquire my company," I said, "through a proxy investment group, using financial information leaked by someone inside my team." He didn't move. His face gave me nothing. "Did you know?" I asked. The silence lasted long enough to feel like a physical object between us. "Yes," he said. The word landed like a stone in still water. "Long." My voice was very quiet. Before the letter was sent, I absorbed that. The elegant trap, the 40 million won invitation, the 90-minute presentation, the 3 in the morning corridor, my name and his voice, all of it constructed before I walked into any of it. "Then why?" I said, and my voice broke on the last syllable just slightly, just enough. "Are you telling me now?" He stepped forward, just one step, but the space between us changed. "I didn't tell you," he said. "You told me." "That's not an answer. My father's plan was to acquire your company, absorb your contracts, and use your international client relationships to move capital that cannot move through conventional channels." His voice was exactly as calm as always, and somehow that made it worse and better simultaneously. "I agreed to invite you into the building because he asked me to. I signed the contract because—" He stopped. "Because why?" I said. He looked at me for a long moment. The rain hit the windows. Seoul moved silently 40 floors below. "Because I wanted to know if you were as capable as you seemed in that gala room when you looked at me like I was simply a rude stranger and not something that people in this city cross streets to avoid." Something cracked open in my chest. "And were you going to let it happen?" I asked. "The acquisition, the asset stripping. Were you going to let your father dismantle what I built?" "No. How can I believe that?" He crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet from me. His eyes held mine with that complete, careful attention I had felt the very first night, and up close, this near, I could see what lived behind the stillness, not coldness, not emptiness. Something guarded so long it had almost forgotten it was guarded. "Because," he said, very quietly, "I have already blocked 3 of my father's proxy acquisition attempts in the last 30 days. He doesn't know it was me. And because the person inside your company who was leaking information was dismissed from Jeon Holdings' extended network this morning. By me, without explanation to my father." I stared at him. "You were protecting me," I said, not a question. An inventory of everything I had assumed and everything I had gotten wrong. I was. A pause. "I am." "Why?" The question hovered between us. He didn't answer immediately. He turned and walked to the window and stood with his back to me, looking out at the city the way I had seen him look at it that night in the corridor. And I thought, this is the most honest I have ever seen him. Because, he said finally, to the rain, to the city, to the version of himself that only existed at 3 a.m. and in empty corridors, and in this room, my father built everything we have on a foundation that cost other people everything they had. And I have spent 10 years making certain that the company he hands to me is clean, but I cannot make what he did clean. I can only refuse to add to it. He turned to look at me. You built something real with nothing given to you. I will not let him take it. I said nothing for a long time then. You are a deeply complicated man, Jeon Siwon. Something moved across his face, the shadow of that almost smile. You are not what I expected either. What did you expect? Someone who would take the money and not ask questions. You clearly knew nothing about me, he said. I knew exactly enough to know I needed to know more. I did not go home that night, not for the reason a story like this might suggest, or not only for that reason. It was late, and the rain was merciless, and we talked until the city outside changed from night black to gray to the pale, cold gold of a Seoul dawn. He made coffee with the focused, unhurried attention he applied to everything. I sat on a dark gray sofa with my heels finally off and my guard genuinely lowered for the first time in 14 months in this city. And we talked about things that had nothing and everything to do with what mattered. He told me about MIT, about studying economics in a city where no one knew his family name, and for the first time in his life, he was simply a person, accountable only to his own competence. He told me this without sentimentality, the way people describe things that shaped them so fundamentally they no longer feel the shape. They have simply become it. I told him about Adaeze Creative Group's first year. The clients who delayed payment for 6 months because they assumed a young black woman running a brand consultancy in West Africa couldn't possibly have the leverage to enforce a contract. The investor meeting in Lagos where the man across the table had spoken exclusively to my male colleague, despite the fact that I was the founder, the CEO, and the one who had flown in from London. The moment I decided I would expand to Seoul specifically because it was the hardest market, and if I could survive it, I could survive anything. He listened the way he did everything completely. No interruptions, no reassurances that weren't earned. When I finished, he said, "You chose the hardest thing." "Always," I said. "So did I," he said. And I understood he wasn't talking about business school. By the time the light changed, something between us had shifted. Not resolved, nothing as dramatic as that, but shifted the way tectonic plates shift. Beneath the surface, fundamental, not yet visible in the landscape above, but already rearranging everything that will grow there. Jeon Siwon requested a meeting on Monday, not with Siwon, with me. The message came through formal channels, through Jeon Holdings' Executive Coordination Office, and it was phrased as an invitation, which we both understood meant it was not optional. Siwon told me about it Sunday evening by phone, his voice carrying that particular controlled evenness that I was learning to read the way you learn to read weather. Calm surface, pressure building underneath. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know. We'll try to assess you, to find what can be used." "Him try," I said. A silence, then, "Zara," my name, still careful. "He is not like me." "I know that too." Another pause, and then quietly without the boardroom armor, "Be careful." I went. Jeon Siwon was 71 years old and looked like what happened when power had been inhabiting a body long enough to become indistinguishable from the bones themselves. He was smaller than I expected. His son had his height, but not from his father. He had sharp eyes, the eyes of a man who had navigated 60 years of a world that rewarded calculation over sentiment, and he wore his wealth with the absolute ease of someone who had never once had to consider that it might not be there. He was perfectly gracious. That was the most frightening thing. He poured tea. He asked about my business. He complimented my soul expansion with the specific warmth of someone who does their research. And then, after 20 minutes of this elegant, silken performance, he said, "You are good for my son." I looked at him. "He has been distracted," Jeon Siwon continued pleasantly. "Distracted men make poor decisions. Poor decisions are expensive." He set down his cup. "I would like you to continue working with Jeon Holdings. Long term, I would be willing to discuss a significant equity arrangement, a genuine partnership." "Exchange for what?" I asked. He smiled. "In exchange for your continued presence, and your continued influence on my son's attention." I understood exactly what he was saying. He wanted me contained, managed, placed, a known variable in a system he was trying to control. He had realized that acquiring my company would be opposed by Siwon, and so he had pivoted to a more elegant solution: acquire me as an asset in a different sense entirely. I set my own cup down. "Mr. Jeon," I said, "I appreciate the tea, but I am not a variable in your equation. I am not a tool for managing your son, and any arrangement that treats me as either is not an arrangement I will accept." I stood. I picked up my bag. I looked at him once directly, the way his son had looked at me across a gala room on a night that had rearranged the coordinates of my life. "I'm certain," I said, "that a man of your experience understands the difference between someone who can be bought and someone who can simply choose to be somewhere." I walked out. Siwon was waiting outside the building. He was leaning against a black car in the afternoon light, arms crossed, watching me walk out with an expression that had more in it than I had ever seen his face contain at one time. Relief, something fierce and carefully restrained, something that looked from a distance like pride. "How did you know I started. "I know my father," he said, "and I know you." We stood on the pavement in the cold October light of Seoul, and I looked at him, this man who was feared and complicated and quietly, stubbornly trying to build something clean from something that had not been. And I thought about what Yetund had said. Figure out what he's telling you before you walk into his world. He had been telling me from the beginning in the only language he reliably spoke: action, observation, protection without announcement. "Your father is going to make this very difficult," I said. "Yes, you knew that and brought me here anyway." He met my eyes. "I brought you here because the contract was real and the offer was fair and you were the right person for the work. Everything else," a pause, "everything else became its own reason. That's the most romantic thing you've said to me." "Not a romantic person," I said. "You're better than that. You're someone who shows up." He looked at me for a long moment. The city moved around us, taxis, pedestrians, the endless productive hum of Seoul, and inside it this small, still pocket of something that had been building since a gala, since a proposal, since a corridor at 3 a.m. He reached out and adjusted the lapel of my coat. Just that. A quiet, deliberate gesture. His fingers barely touching. "Dinner," he said. "Tonight, not a business dinner." "Okay," I said. "My restaurant. Not a Jeon Holdings property. My own." I hadn't known he had a restaurant. I filed that away alongside the books, the art, the coffee made with focused attention, the 7 minutes in the lobby, and then let her up. "Okay," I said again. He nodded. He opened the car door, and just before I got in, I said, "For what it's worth, that night at the gala, I didn't know who you were." "I know," he said. "That bother you, that I spoke to you like that before I knew." "No," something shifted in his face. That shadow smile, closer to the surface than I had ever seen it. It was the first time in years that someone spoke to me like I was simply a person in a room. I looked at him. He looked at me. The understanding moved between us, wordless and complete. "In, Zara," he said. "You'll be cold." I got in. Seoul doesn't stop for anyone. That's its power and its cruelty. It simply continues, indifferent to the private seismic events that reshape people's lives within its borders. But for what it's worth, there is a restaurant in Insadong that most people walk past without knowing who owns it. It has 12 tables, plain wooden ones, and a menu written on a chalkboard, and the food is extraordinary in the way that only completely honest cooking ever is. On a Friday evening in late October, a woman in a cobalt blue coat walked in and was led to a corner table without being asked for a reservation, and a man who never smiled in boardrooms sat across from her and did something that made the woman laugh. A real laugh, the unguarded kind, and the sommelier who had worked there for 6 years said later that he had never seen the owner's face look like that before. He said he wasn't sure exactly what the expression was. Only that it belonged there. The city holds 1,000 stories beneath its glittering surface. Jeon Siwon has not conceded. The person who leaked from Adaeze's creative group has not been named. And somewhere in the architecture of a company that was built on blood and is trying to survive on something better, a war is coming that neither Siwon nor Zara has the luxury of avoiding. Part 2 begins where love gets dangerous. If this story grabbed you, don't let it go. You just watched 2 people who shouldn't exist in the same world decide to exist there anyway. And it cost them nothing yet. Part 2 is where it costs everything. Jeon Siwon moves. The identity of the company mole is revealed, and it's the last person you'd expect. Siwon makes a choice that puts both their lives in a different kind of danger. And Zara discovers something about her own past that connects her to the Jeon family in a way that was never supposed to be found. Subscribe right now, because part 2 drops soon and the algorithm will bury it before it reaches you. Like this video if Siwon and Zara already live in your head. Comment below. Are you team? Siwon knew exactly what he was doing from day 1, or team, he was just as blindsided as she was. The answer is in part 2. Don't miss it. Share with your most chaotic friend who needs a new obsession. This story isn't done. Neither are they. See you in part 2.